Well, good morning. Today, again, I'm carrying on with the research that I did on the Pali roots of many of these words. It's interesting even looking at it from a simply Sanskrit perspective as well. I'm actually procrastinating on finishing the book from the Joe Rogan experience. The author escapes me currently. The book is Breath, or Breathe. I can't quite remember. Again, I don't script any of my podcasts. I apologize for what a meandering stroll they tend to be. Frustrating for many, but if you just get into them like a warm bath, as opposed to Cliff Notes, you might understand it a little bit better. But further to that, I will actually make sure to finish the book Breathe. The reason why I haven't is because it doesn't have a lot of great detail. So what I've gone and done is I even picked up that one book I mentioned that's about Chinese breathing. They attribute it to Taoist. I argue it's actually yogic, and you'll get what I mean by that in a moment. So what am I getting at here? Pranayama. I've mentioned this before, but relating specifically to the Joe Rogan experience. I think the gentleman's name was Nestor, but don't quote me on that. He wrote the book Breathe. You can take a look. It was a Joe Rogan experience episode from not too long back. He mentioned the yoga of psychic heat. It's interesting on a number of different fronts. He mentions the Tibetan name for it, Tummo. Also interesting, because I don't know if he realizes that the yoga of psychic heat is also shared by the Kundalini tradition. And whether they are the same tradition as what I'm going to read from here, which is a book that's well over 100 years old, and it is some of the very few sources we have on Tummo. Tummo is a tantric practice, specifically Tibetan. It's a Tibetan version of the Kundalini. That's actually interesting too, right? Kundalini, how you pronounce it properly. But Kundalini Yoga has a number of these practices. And then honestly, it mentions here these tantric practices that are used together to achieve the final ends. The remainder of these practices, as example here, the doctrine of the illusory body, the doctrine of the dream state. We've discussed that ourselves. The doctrine of the after-death state, right? And finally, the doctrine of consciousness transference. All of them, if you notice, save for Tummo, the doctrine of psychic heat, are actually Bardo states, interestingly enough. Something we discussed in the previous Joe Rogan experience when he was talking about the benefits and the power of those Bardo states, the between waking and a sleep state, the sleep state, and then, honestly, of course, he's not going to talk about some of the between death and life states, and of course not understand the power of the awake state. Why? Because the power that lies in the awakened Bardo lies in utilizing the awareness, or the prana paramita, the perfection of wisdom. Thus, you achieve this extraordinary power, or the awakened state itself becomes extraordinary. So, on that note, I'm just going to read a little bit of the doctrine of the psychic heat, Tummo. So it's a tantric practice signifying a peculiar bodily heat, a warmth of a psycho-physical character generated by yogic means. According to the secret lore, the word Tummo refers to a method of extracting prana. There's that prana again, energy, translated into Chinese as energy and breath, because it did mean both, but not at the same time, but interchangeably, similar to dharma, a multi-use word. But I go on. It says, from the inexhaustible pranic reservoir in nature is where we're meant to extract that prana. Not dissimilar from Jikung. This is why I mentioned Jikung. If you look at Jikung and Gung Fu as it flowed from there, it was taught by Bodhidharma, who was a southern Indian, arguably, and he was taught this tradition of yoga, but also the middle way, this Nalanda tradition or Chittamatrin, this mind-only type school, but certainly not ignoring yoga practice. It says you store this prana, which in Jikung, as I said, you can absorb through the feet. But again, it is a matter of proper practice. Again, I find it funny. You can see, since Bodhidharma or many Indian sages were known to have traveled through the area that we're talking about here, Indonesia and Malaysia, all these different locales before eventually arriving in China, which was the normal way. The overland route was a little bit crazy. It would be much easier to sail, particularly in the case of Bodhidharma, who lived in a trading sailors. I mean, he was surrounded by sailors, so it was really no big deal for him to hitch a ride. So I just want to mention once again, this is not dissimilar from Qigong, which is, as I said, attributed to Taoism. But when you see its root in Hinduism, I laugh. I laugh like I laugh at Pyro, who was so arrogant after a visit, I say 3rd century AD, after a visit to India, a continent with a long history of sharing and even developing like a superposition philosophy, meaning take the best of a couple ideas and create a new, or one that was just evolved from previous thoughts. But here's Pyro, so arrogant to think that he went home and developed this independent thought system, which then was translated and brought back to India and influenced Madhyamaka, Yogacara, and Chittamatrin, and arguably even the entire Nalanda tradition. This university was set up because somebody read Pyro's work and his philosophy. Come on. So I go on with the doctrine of psychic heat. Oh, I apologize. This is from Tibetan Yoga and Secret Doctrines, edited by Ivan Wentz. So we're looking, 120 to 140 years ago, depending on when he actually published it. You can look it up. I can't remember. So I'll go on, and he says, this system, invisible to all save those possessed of clairvoyant vision, again, another one of these extraordinary powers, is the psychic counterpart of physical nervous system, right? So what they're talking about is that dhyana, right? So that's training of the mind. So you must be an adept in the training of the mind, obviously, first. Its nerve channels are called, in Tibetan, sas, and in Sanskrit, nadi. Now, they were talking, again, about the chakras and the energy channels. In China, they call them the meridians. So again, a lot of this that we attribute to Taoism arguably could be yogic in origin, Indian, maybe even Turco-Persian, somewhere from the north. So really, it's kind of funny that there isn't just the white man's arrogance that we developed our philosophies and cultures independent of some of these other cultures. And it's just as arrogant, say the yellow arrogance, to believe that, for example, that Asia developed independent of the Indian subcontinent or Greece or Europe. I've mentioned before possibly that there's evidence that the Vikings were able to trade all the way into the Silk Route. So from Scandinavia, the North Sea, all the way to the China Sea, whether they sailed to Shanghai, because it's interesting, the international settlement had been an international port for centuries before modern history. But whether the Vikings had traded into the Silk Route or even traveled the Silk Route themselves, or possibly more likely sailed all the way. But once again, this all belies the fact that we all suffer from this ego to believe we're different or special, and there's no way that we developed interdependently. See what I did there? But I go on, and he talks about these nerve channels that you have to work with within the body as well as the mind. Not unlike I said, Einstein talks about space and time being connected, but they do operate independent. Kind of like what we're talking about here. Shunyata, emptiness, is about interdependent or dependent origination, right? And I'll go on further, and he does begin to talk about prana again, and chakras, right? And references the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And the next paragraph says that according to the text, in practicing the art of Tummo, the yogin must employ very elaborate visualizations, meditations, postures, breathing, directing of thought, training of the psychic nerve system, that's what we mentioned before, and physical exercises, right? Not at all dissimilar to yoga and jikang, as taught by, arguably as taught by Bodhidharma. Right? Training of the psychic nerve system, the physical exercise. And don't forget that it mentioned before that you have to be already training the mind. And more importantly, pati. So you must be not only studying the Dharma, but implementing it. Right? And he goes on and says, our annotations are sufficiently numerous and detailed to serve as a commentary to afford the student some practical guidance. But as the Tibetan gurus emphasize, it is highly desirable for a neophyte, prior to beginning the practice of Tummo, to obtain preliminary initiation and personal guidance from a master of the art. And he'll go on and talk about how you recognize, someone, and actually later he mentions they're in the order of the cotton-clad ones. Why does he say that? Because they don't wear furs and woolen garments, right? Are they never wearing furs or woolen garments or seeking artificial external heat? That's how the masters of the art are recognized. It's funny, eh? But he goes on and says that the yogin must also observe strict sexual continence, for it is chiefly upon the yogically transmuted sex energy that proficiency in Tummo depends. And once again, not self-servingly, but I remind you we've discussed this in a previous podcast. Actually, we've discussed it more than once. One where we talked about the golden flower. That is commonly considered a Taoist treatise. But as you can see here, is it possibly yogic in origins? Right? And the other side of this is we've talked about the Taoist sexual practices of I apologize, not sexual practices per se. We've talked about developing sexual energy, right? And how they use it, the Taoists. There's actually a sexual energy, jikang, believe it or not, right? And so I find it funny that they mention this. And he goes on and says that actually practicing must not be done inside or near dwelling of a householder, preferably in some place of a hermitage, right? Maybe in a cave, right? A yogin aiming at mastery of the art may remain in such solitary hermitage for a very long time. See no human being, right? And performing these yogic exercises early in the morning before sunrise, when nature and the earth's magnetic currents are apt to be the least disturbed. Once the art is mastered, it can be practiced anywhere at any time. I love this, because this is the practice. Why do we get up early in the morning and sit on a cushion somewhere quiet in the corner? Not because the earth's magnetic currents are more calm, but because the everything is more quiet, right? We do it because we find it easier to still the mind when it's not so loud. There I go again, referencing some of our previous podcasts. Right? Right? And again, the goal, as I said before, sitting is a neophyte practice. Why? because once the art is mastered, it can be practiced anywhere and at any time. And I would actually argue that it's not once the art is mastered, it can be. Once the art is mastered, it must be. The goal, the initial goal, is to bring this practice into everyday life. A new Pali compound word I'd like to introduce you to is sati pati pati. That's S-A-T-I, which means to remember, or mindfulness, and pati pati. That's P-A-T-I, P-A-T-T-I. So that's studying the Dharma and implementing it as practice. Right? And as I said before, it goes on and talks about Milarepa, and he was talking about warming breath of angels, whereas their raiment pure and soft. Now, you can read that as an invitation to the doctrine of psychic heat, or you can read that as an invitation to let none of the colors, the sights, the sounds of the phenomenal world to distract you, for you to be the charioteer. And he says, when the probationary training ends and the neophyte feels confident of success, right? The following account of such a testing is given by Madame David-Neel. The reason why I mention this is that is the opera singer, the middle-aged lady that traveled to Tibet at a time that no women or foreigners were allowed. That is the lady that the author of Breathe mentioned without mentioning her name. That's the lady he mentioned on the Joe Rogan Experience. She's interesting. But even more interesting is she's a neophyte herself. Who was her mentor? A lady by the name of Helena Petrovska Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky. Now, who was she a contemporary of? She was a contemporary of Olcott, Ivan Wentz, and more. Gentlemen who were seeking occult knowledge. And amongst them were this Madame David-Neel, Madame Blavatsky, and that's a little insight to my early days, when, particularly in Canada, but the West, there is very little to be had beyond, say, basic information on tantric Buddhism. I consider myself a Yogacaran, a tantric Buddhist. When there was very little information on this subject, I was able to turn to Madame Blavatsky, Madame David-Neel, the Buddhist and the Pali Society in France, and to use my ability to read and learn in French. In fact, I would invite you to maybe invite bilingual speakers to translate some wonderful documentaries on Madame David-Neel. Alexandra David-Neel is her name, and it's a hyphenated last name if you want to look her up. And she wrote a book with mystics and magicians in Tibet. But I'll warn you, not all of her books were fact. She did some fiction. Again, she was trying to, not unlike the Tibetans, awaken this sense of wonder so that we could awaken to this wisdom that's innate in all of us. Right? And it quotes from Madame David-Neel. Upon a frosty winter night, those who think themselves capable of victoriously enduring the test, they're led to the shore of a river or a lake. If all the streams are frozen in the region, a hole is made in the ice. A moonlit night, or a moonlight night, with a hard wind blowing is chosen. Such nights are not rare in Tibet during the winter months. The neophytes sit on the ground cross-legged and naked. Sheets are dipped in the icy water. Each man wraps himself in one of them and must dry it on his body. As soon as the sheet has become dry, it is again dipped in the water and placed on the novice's body to be dried as before. The operation goes on in that way until daybreak. Then he who has dried the largest number of sheets is acknowledged the winner of the competition. So here I find this funny. The Heart Sutra teaches us, and I know it's a later treatise. I can say the same of the Lanka Vatara, that teaches us there is no attainment, right? You simply do or do not. In this case, I find it funny that it becomes a competition. I also find it funny that the idea here is simply to dry sheets, right? So really, the only extraordinary power, once again, is our underestimation of the power of the human mind. I'll remind us the incredible strength of the human placebo, that in nearly as many instances as not, that the mind can produce the identical results as a medication. And I'll go on. She talks about the size of the sheets being different sizes, and again talks about Milarepa, the cotton-clad one, meaning he mastered the art of Tummo under the guidance of his guru, Marpa. And then, of course, his disciples as well. And it goes on, it says, in addition to the drying of wet sheets, another test to ascertain their degree of warmth with which the yogin can generate consists in making them sit naked in snow, a quantity of snow melted under and around them, indicating their proficiency. Again, two things, no attainment, and secondly, we see this in a modern viral sense, that we have a gentleman who has appropriated this practice and making it, again, using ego as the driver, thinking that he's special, when in reality, everybody has the power to achieve these extraordinary powers only because we undersell our own abilities, thus oversell the results. Not unlike the stars in the sky that I mentioned in yesterday's podcast. We're awed by all of these stars, and yet we never see all the space between. And the text goes on and says, there are at the present time adepts of the Tummo and Hermitage in Tibet, many of whom, followers of Milarepa, in the order of the cotton-clad ones. This is undoubtedly true, is the assertion. This is over 100 years ago, remember. More than one European has occasionally caught glimpses of such aesthetics, and he goes on and talks about having traveled into the Himalayas with a group of Hindus who were clad in nothing or barely nothing. He talks about how they were on their way to Hermitage in the Himalayas, a cave by the name of Amarnath. And if you look that up, you'll hear this is actually a commonly referred to cave. It's kind of like a shared holy place, not unlike Jerusalem. Amarnath is sacred to many traditions. He goes on and says, wherein the Holy of Holies is a natural lingam. A great word, lingam, no longer used, means a phallus. It's a lingam of ice, sacred to Shiva, the Lord of the world. And I'll read the note. Shiva, the personification of forces in nature, making for destruction, is the Lord of regeneration, and so his symbol is the phallus, or the male organ of generation, as it was of Osiris, the Egyptian deity associated with human fertility. I find that funny because you can see a lot of, shared well, take a look at Egyptian Lord. It rings similar to a lot of other lore, believe it or not. I won't even specifically just say Indian because, it shares myth and metaphor with many, many cultures. Okay? And I'll just go on and say it also mentions, as I said, Shiva, but as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, Shiva is has a penchant for overdoing it. Thus, his consort, Parvati, known for her balancing influence on Shiva. Again, the destroyer, but also the creator. So these ascetics had come to the cave to worship Shiva, and they did almost an identical practice, wrapping themselves in these sheets. And he goes on and says, at the time he knew nothing of the Tibetan art of generating the extraordinary body warmth. Consequently, he didn't question these Hindus' aesthetics as to their remarkable hardiness, attributing it to the perhaps masters of Hatha Yoga. Funny, because Hatha was a later development. And then he goes on and finishes by saying he'd witnessed it a number of times, and he'd even witnessed another version of this extraordinary powers called Pancha Duni, the 5 fires, in which a yogini, or a yogin, will sit surrounded, and then what he says is by the 5, surrounded by in the 4 directions, and the 5th being the heat of the sun. And he sees them untouched by these externals, and what he calls, let's see here, and in some of the devil dancing ceremonies of Ceylon fire, trodden upon and grasped by the devil dancers without harm, in virtue of the use of mantras called fire cooling mantras. And prior, when he was talking about the practices, the yoga practice of Panchaduni, he said he had witnessed, and it had been attested by many Europeans, seeing their immunity from the heat. So, again, initially, I just wanted to share this practice, right? Very esoteric, because there's very few who have even written about it. But once you start to research the yoga practice, you get an idea that it's not even meant to be an attainment. It's so common, even back to the original practitioners, they were guilty of treating it like an attainment as well. But again, the real attainment was personal, right? We look at it from a Western egoic perspective, and we think, well, yeah, the most devout was celebrated as the most developed practitioner of the art. But you got to remember, it's about intention. If you reside, hopefully, parasamgate, on the other shore, away from these egoic influences, if you reside in that truth, that awareness, then when you sit down and practice your Tummo with all of your buddies, it's not a competition to see who's better. It is simply encouraging each other on that path to liberation, right? That's that pati, right? It's not just studying the doctrine of psychic heat, but it's implementing it and carrying it with you into everyday practice.